On the cold morning of October 25, 1415, a narrow field near the village of Agincourt in northern France became the stage for what should have been a massacre. King Henry V of England stood before an army of barely 6,000 men, many weakened by hunger and disease after the brutal siege of Harfleur, facing a French force at least 3 times larger. Across the muddy expanse, banners of powerful French nobles fluttered with confidence. Their knights, encased in heavy steel armor, represented the pride of medieval warfare. By every conventional measure, the outcome seemed inevitable. The English were exhausted, outnumbered, and deep in hostile territory. Yet Henry did not retreat. He positioned his men deliberately, anchoring them between 2 dense forests that narrowed the battlefield and neutralized the French numerical advantage. Rain had turned the freshly plowed ground into thick mud, and what looked like misfortune would soon become opportunity. As dawn light filtered through mist, the French prepared to crush what they believed was a doomed invading force. But this battle would defy expectation. Numbers alone would not decide the day. Leadership, discipline, terrain, and a weapon underestimated by Europe's finest knights were about to change history forever. When Henry V ascended to the English throne in 1413, he inherited more than a crown, he inherited uncertainty. His father, Henry IV, had seized power through rebellion, leaving questions about legitimacy lingering over the dynasty. England itself was restless, divided by factional rivalries and economic strain. A young king needed not only authority, but proof of strength. For Henry, France offered both opportunity and justification. The 100 Years' War, which had begun in 1337, had long tied the English crown to claims over French territory through the Plantagenet bloodline. These claims were not new, but under Henry they gained renewed urgency. War promised unity at home and glory abroad. Unlike the reckless prince described in earlier years, Henry V emerged as disciplined, deeply religious, and intensely focused. He understood that kingship required spectacle as much as strategy. By reviving England's claim to the French throne, he framed his campaign not as ambition, but as rightful inheritance. Negotiations with France were conducted firmly, even provocatively. When French envoys reportedly mocked his demands with a gift of tennis balls, suggesting he was better suited for games than governance, it reinforced his resolve. Whether the story was embellished or not, the message was clear: Henry would not tolerate humiliation. In 1415, he gathered an army and crossed the English Channel, landing in Normandy with calculated confidence. His objective was not reckless conquest but demonstration, showing both allies and enemies that England remained a formidable power. The siege of Harfleur tested that resolve. Disease spread quickly through his ranks, and weeks of resistance drained strength and supplies. Many urged retreat. Yet Henry pressed forward, determined that failure would only embolden France and weaken his fragile authority at home. He understood something essential about power: perception could shape reality. By maintaining composure in adversity, by appearing unwavering even when circumstances deteriorated, he projected inevitability. His army, though small, moved with cohesion. Discipline replaced doubt. Each step toward Calais became a statement of endurance. French forces shadowed his march, confident that exhaustion would finish what numbers could guarantee. But Henry sought not open confrontation on their terms. He waited, maneuvered, and studied the land. War, for Henry V, was not a gamble. It was a calculated assertion of legitimacy. He needed victory not merely to gain territory, but to secure his crown. The road to Agincourt was paved with more than ambition, it was shaped by necessity, pressure, and the understanding that one decisive triumph could silence rivals both in France and in England. After the grueling capture of Harfleur in September 1415, Henry V faced a harsh reality. Nearly a third of his army had been weakened or lost to dysentery, and the original momentum of invasion had faded into exhaustion. Many commanders would have chosen to sail home, declaring the siege a sufficient victory. But Henry understood that retreat without a decisive statement would be seen as weakness. Instead, he made a bold decision: he would march his diminished force across northern France to the English-held port of Calais, demonstrating that his army could move unchallenged through enemy territory. The march was punishing. Autumn rains soaked the countryside, turning roads into sludge. Supplies ran thin, and French forces gathered in increasing numbers, tracking the English advance from a distance. French nobles, eager for glory and confident in their superiority, assembled a massive army to intercept Henry before he could reach safety. They believed time was on their side. The longer the English marched, the weaker they would become. Henry's army moved with discipline despite hardship. Soldiers carried what little they could, conserving strength, avoiding unnecessary engagements. The French attempted to block river crossings, forcing delays and stretching the English endurance even further. Hunger and sickness lingered, yet morale held. Henry maintained order and purpose, reinforcing the idea that survival depended on cohesion. Meanwhile, the French prepared for what they believed would be a triumphant confrontation. Their force swelled with armored knights and noble cavalry, eager to crush the invaders and restore honor. Confidence bordered on arrogance. They expected the English to either surrender or collapse under pressure. Instead, Henry maneuvered carefully, searching for ground that would offset numerical disadvantage. By late October, near the small village of Agincourt, the two armies finally converged. The French blocked the path north, cutting off further retreat. Escape was no longer an option. Yet the field between two dense forests offered something unexpected, a narrow corridor that limited the deployment of France's superior numbers. Rain had fallen heavily, turning freshly plowed soil into deep, clinging mud. Exhausted, outnumbered, and trapped, the English army stood facing overwhelming force. The French believed victory would come swiftly with the first charge. But Henry had chosen his ground with care. The battlefield itself would soon become his ally, and what appeared to be a desperate stand would transform into one of the most astonishing reversals in medieval warfare. By the morning of October 25, 1415, the field near Agincourt had become more than open ground, it had become a trap shaped by rain, terrain, and deliberate positioning. The space between the forests of Traincourt and Agincourt narrowed the battlefield to only a few hundred yards across. What should have favored the larger French force instead compressed it. Thousands of heavily armored knights and men-at-arms were forced into a tight formation, unable to spread out or maneuver freely. Overnight rain had soaked the freshly plowed farmland, turning it into thick, clinging mud that swallowed boots and dragged at horses' hooves. Every step would demand effort. Henry V arranged his army with calculated precision. At the center stood his men-at-arms, dismounted and fighting on foot to create a solid defensive line. On both flanks, English longbowmen formed angled wings, each archer equipped not only with a bow but with sharpened wooden stakes driven into the ground before them. These stakes tilted outward, forming a deadly barrier against cavalry charges. The English position was defensive, disciplined, and compact. Across the muddy stretch, the French army prepared for what they believed would be a crushing advance. Their plan relied on weight and shock. Mounted knights would charge first, scattering the English archers, followed by waves of armored infantry that would overwhelm the center. Confidence was visible in their ranks, many expected the battle to be short and decisive. Honor demanded aggression. Henry, meanwhile, moved among his men, reinforcing unity and resolve. He knew that survival depended on maintaining formation. There would be no reckless advance, no dramatic clash of equal forces. The English would hold, absorb, and strike at the right moment. The narrow ground meant the French could not fully deploy their superior numbers. Instead of surrounding the English, they would funnel directly into them. When the French cavalry finally surged forward, the mud immediately betrayed them. Horses struggled to gain speed, their charge losing momentum before impact. The confined space caused confusion, and fallen riders created obstacles for those behind them. What was meant to be a thunderous assault began to unravel before it reached the English line. The battlefield had shifted from a contest of numbers to a contest of conditions. Terrain, weather, and preparation had quietly stripped the advantage from France. As the first wave faltered, a new force prepared to speak, not steel, but something faster, lighter, and devastatingly precise. The sky itself was about to darken with the sound of war. As the French cavalry struggled forward through the mud, the English longbowmen began their assault. Thousands of arrows were loosed in disciplined volleys, arcing high before descending into the densely packed ranks. The longbow was not merely a weapon of range, it was a weapon of repetition. A skilled archer could release multiple arrows in the time it took a crossbowman to fire one. Years of mandatory training in England had turned common men into lethal specialists, capable of drawing bows with immense force and accuracy. The sky above Agincourt darkened with shafts, and what had seemed like a distant nuisance became a relentless storm. The first wave of French knights felt the impact almost immediately. Arrows struck armor joints, pierced visors, and wounded horses. Even when they failed to penetrate steel, the sheer force and frequency disoriented men and mounts alike. Horses reared and stumbled, throwing riders into the sucking mud. Fallen bodies created obstacles for those advancing behind them. Momentum, the very heart of a cavalry charge, collapsed under the weight of terrain and constant bombardment. Behind the disordered cavalry came the French men-at-arms, advancing on foot in heavy armor. They pressed forward with determination, but the mud dragged at every step. Armor designed for protection now became a burden. As they moved through the churned ground, arrows continued to fall. The narrow battlefield compressed their formation further, forcing men into suffocating proximity. Those at the front, slowed by mud and bodies, were pushed from behind by those still advancing, creating chaos within their own ranks. When the French finally reached the English line, they were already exhausted. The English men-at-arms held firm, braced and ready. What followed was brutal, intimate combat, axes, swords, and daggers clashing at close range. Yet even here, the earlier damage shaped the outcome. Many French knights, weighed down and struggling to rise after falls, found themselves vulnerable. English soldiers moved with relative freedom, less encumbered by armor and supported by archers who now joined the melee with mallets and knives. The longbow had done more than inflict casualties, it had shattered coordination and confidence. The French assault, intended to overwhelm, became a suffocating mass of trapped men unable to maneuver or retreat. Each wave pressed into the collapse of the one before it. What should have been a swift victory turned into a desperate struggle for survival. And as the battle raged, the psychological advantage shifted decisively. The smaller army, once expected to break, now stood unyielding while its larger enemy drowned in its own advance. As the French advance collapsed into confusion, the battle shifted from thunderous charge to suffocating struggle. Knights who had ridden into combat expecting glory now found themselves trapped in mud so thick it swallowed their steps. Armor that once symbolized status and strength became a crushing weight. Many fell and could not rise without assistance. Behind them, more men pressed forward, unaware that those at the front were already pinned and dying. The field became a tangle of bodies, broken lances, and churned earth. The English line held with grim determination. Henry V fought on foot among his men, refusing the safety of the rear. His presence reinforced discipline at the moment it mattered most. English soldiers targeted weakened opponents, dragging fallen knights down and finishing them with daggers through visor slits or gaps in armor. The closeness of the fight stripped away ceremony. Titles meant nothing in mud and blood. As the French second line attempted to engage, they found little room to maneuver. Instead of reinforcing momentum, they compounded the congestion. Panic began to ripple backward. What had started as confident assault now felt like entrapment. The sheer weight of numbers became a liability, compressing men into a killing ground with no space to retreat. Then came one of the most controversial decisions of the battle. Reports reached Henry that a group of French forces might be regrouping to attack the English baggage train. Fearing that renewed assault combined with thousands of captured prisoners could overwhelm his exhausted army, Henry issued an order that stunned even some of his own commanders. Prisoners, many of them noble knights, were to be executed to prevent them from rejoining the fight. It was a ruthless calculation driven by survival. The executions were swift and grim, cutting through medieval conventions of ransom and honor. Yet the decision reflected the fragile position Henry still faced. Victory was not secure until the threat of reversal was eliminated. The French army, seeing their comrades cut down even in surrender, felt the final collapse of morale. By late afternoon, the field belonged to England. Thousands of French nobles lay dead or captured, their banners fallen in the mud. The English losses were comparatively light, astonishingly so given the imbalance at dawn. What had seemed an inevitable defeat had become one of the most improbable victories of the medieval age. Discipline, terrain, and calculated ruthlessness had transformed vulnerability into dominance. The aftermath of Agincourt reshaped the political landscape of France and elevated Henry V from embattled claimant to dominant force. The scale of French noble casualties was staggering. Entire lines of aristocracy had been cut down in a single day, dukes, counts, and knights whose families had shaped French politics for generations. Leadership within the French court fractured further, weakening coordination at a moment when unity was desperately needed. What had begun as an attempt to crush a foreign invader ended as a devastating blow to France's ruling elite. Henry understood that the victory's true power lay not only in the battlefield outcome but in its psychological and diplomatic impact. His army returned to England to celebration, reinforcing his legitimacy at home. The image of a small, disciplined force defeating overwhelming odds strengthened national unity and solidified his authority. Agincourt was transformed into proof that his claim to the French throne was not reckless ambition, but divine favor validated through triumph. In the years that followed, Henry leveraged this advantage carefully. France, already divided by internal conflict between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, struggled to recover from its losses. Political instability deepened, and Henry capitalized on the opportunity. Renewed campaigns in Normandy were methodical and relentless. Cities fell one by one as English forces consolidated territory rather than overextending themselves. The turning point came in 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes. Under its terms, Henry was recognized as heir to the French throne and married Catherine of Valois, daughter of King Charles VI of France. The agreement disinherited the French Dauphin and placed the English king in direct line to inherit one of Europe's most powerful crowns. For a moment, it appeared that Agincourt had not merely secured a battlefield victory but had altered the future of both kingdoms. Yet the triumph carried fragility beneath its surface. France remained divided, and loyalty to the treaty was uneven. Henry's power in France depended on continued military presence and political management. Still, the transformation was undeniable. A king who had marched through hostile land with a weakened army now stood as heir to a rival empire. The small army that had once seemed doomed had shifted the balance of power across Western Europe, proving that strategic clarity and disciplined execution could outweigh sheer numbers in determining the fate of nations. Yet even the most astonishing victories cannot escape time. In 1422, only 2 years after securing recognition as heir to the French throne, Henry V died unexpectedly at the age of 35. His triumph at Agincourt and the political gains that followed now rested in the hands of an infant son, Henry VI. The fragile union between England and France depended on sustained strength and leadership, and without Henry's presence, cracks began to widen. French resistance regrouped, and new figures emerged to challenge English dominance. Among them was Joan of Arc, whose determination reignited French morale and reversed much of England's advantage. By 1453, the Hundred Years' War would end with England losing nearly all its continental possessions. Agincourt did not create permanent empire, but it redefined what was possible in medieval warfare. It proved that terrain, preparation, discipline, and clarity of command could overcome overwhelming odds. A small army, led with precision and resolve, had humbled one of Europe's most powerful forces. The legacy of that day endured not because of conquest alone, but because it shattered the belief that numbers guaranteed victory.